We are ready to go with our first speaker. Baye, would you please come up here for a second? For 20 minutes, actually, would be preferable. Go ahead and, yes, got that. Fantastic. I'm going to give her a second to get your slides up. There we go. So this fine gentleman standing before you is Baye McNeil. Again, Yokohama, you may know him as such, author of the Black Eye column on Japan Times, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff. According to his official bio that I have right in front of me, he was born in Brooklyn, New York, emigrated here to Japan in the fine year of 2004. Yes, Brooklyn or New York, which one? Dang, that's a little surprising. He started his blog, Local in Yokohama, in 2008, and it has now become one of the most recognizable destinations in the Japan expat blogosphere. He is the author of 2 memoirs. The first of which is Hi, My Name is Loco, and I Am a Racist, which was voted to the top 10 list of books by black authors that year. His monthly column is, as I said, called Black Eye in Japan Times, and gives a perspective, often missed, of life in Japan through the eyes of people of African descent. Baye currently resides in the fine-ass town of Yokohama. It's all you. Have fun.
Thank you very much, Sean. And thank you, Andrew and Amanda, for inviting me. Going to get started here. Hi, I'm Baye McNeil, alien activist. I still remember my first foray into activism. This was back in the US, in my hometown, Brooklyn, New York. I was 7 years old and attended a very peaceful, altercation-free protest. Not that one. This one. It was a police shooting of a child not much older than I. His name was Clifford Glover. He was 10 years old, and he was shot in the back by a New York City police officer, Thomas Shea, in Queens, New York. Now, this wasn't exactly a rare occurrence back in Brooklyn. But what was rare was, as a result of protests and demonstrations citywide, Shea was actually indicted. The first officer in New York City history to be indicted in such a case. The following year, a jury of 10 whites and 1 black acquitted Shea, and we were out in the streets again, keeping the pressure on the city until Shea was fired. Of course, I didn't understand much of this when I was a kid. I was just a child marching with signs that read, "I could be next," or "Save the children." Everyone in my school, students and teachers, were out there in the streets regularly. This was a social studies class for us. These were our field trips. We were learning what it means to be an alien in America. This was the first of many such acts of activism for me. Some would eventually succeed, like our decades-long boycotts and protests over the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela. Our efforts led to global recognition of this injustice and his eventual release and the end of apartheid. I learned at that tender age an important lesson. Activism doesn't always work out the way you want it to, or when you want it to, or even how you intended it to, but it always brings results. But let me backtrack a little. I wasn't born an activist. What does Black Lives Matter to an infant? Look at that smile. Not a care in the world. The only black life that mattered to me was the one with the 2 breasts. But as you can clearly see, I was born an alien. I didn't know it then, of course, but I didn't know much of anything then. Maybe you're wondering, what the heck is he talking about, an alien? I know what aliens look like. This is what they look like. Or maybe one of these. But like many words, aliens has a number of meanings. What is an alien? So, well, number 1 and number 2 don't apply. I am legally an American. But number 3, and if judged by the behavior of many of the citizens of America, and a good number of the citizens here as well, truth be told, number 4 can be true as well. You see, the problem started before, way back before I was born, 200 some odd years before I was born to be exact. the Declaration of Independence. In 1776, arguably the most important document in American history was signed. But neither the writer of this sacred document, Thomas Jefferson, nor any of the other slave owners who signed it were thinking of people of African descent when they used the word men. My ancestors were excluded. They were also excluded for the most part from the US Constitution. And the amendments that followed were chock full of loopholes and ambiguities. And so, black people remained aliens by exclusion until around the time my mother started bringing little aliens into the world. It was my mother who decided that her little alien son would not grow up to be ashamed of his alien features, traits like his black skin, thick lips, wide nose, and kinky afro. She decided I would be proud of my history and culture. So she enrolled me in a private school, an institution with the express purpose of offsetting and undoing the damage done to black minds and black lives due to exclusion, alienation, and the resulting injustices. She sent me to a school called Uhuru Sasa Shule. It means Freedom Now School. This is me and my classmates in first grade. Can you find me? We all look alike, don't we? I'm that alien activist in training in the top left corner. That's me. Our teachers trained us to be warriors of a sort. Non-violent warriors, of course, armed with intelligence, knowledge of self, racial pride, and cultural self-esteem. Think a cross between Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Huey P. Newton. This was the Pan-African Black Power movement, one of a dozen precursors to what, in its most recent incarnation, is known as Black Lives Matter. Basically, a 200-plus year ongoing rebellion against injustice and exclusion. I know what you're thinking. Damn, them some serious-looking kids. Where's the smiles? Well, there's no time for Sesame Street in Disneyland when you're a pre-adolescent community activist, born with a target on your back and a life expectancy of about 25. Which begs the question, what is activism? It's an effort to promote, impede, or direct social, political, economic, or environmental change. And from first grade through high school, this was my life. Unfortunately, in America, as a black person, there was always some kind of injustice that begged to be confronted head on. Think District 9, but replace the aliens with, well, aliens. In fact, the necessity of confronting injustice was true of any person of any race if they believed in this immutable truth. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. MLK was nothing if not a prophet, and I truly believe that it was the failure of Americans to grasp this truth, combined with our tolerance of injustice against the most vulnerable in our society, and our failure to unite and take action against intolerance, that led to the ascension of what's his name? Starts with a T. But as a youth, I wasn't feeling MLK at all. I felt his methods were essentially suicide by cop. Some activist form of kamikaze. And now that I was coming into my own, I wasn't feeling that Pan-African crap anymore either. God damn it, I was an American, an angry-ass black American. So by the time I was in high school and university, having spent my entire childhood on the front lines of civil disobedience, that kind of activism had taken its toll on me. I started looking for inspiration elsewhere, and I found it in the work of artists like Jean-Michel Basquiat, Spike Lee in the films of writer and director Spike Lee, and in the music of hip-hop artists like Public Enemy. They too were angry, but had creative outlets for it. In fact, if these gentlemen hadn't come into my life, I too would probably be in jail or dead by now, especially these cats, Public Enemy. Public Enemy, they channeled the outrage of the whole black community into their music. I don't remember where I was when I heard that John Lennon was killed or when the Challenger space shuttle blew up, but the first time I heard Fight the Power, I was at work in Paragon Sporting Goods in Manhattan on Broadway, in the stockroom, loading boxes, listening to the radio with 5 other black co-workers. We all dropped everything and started banging our heads against the wall. It was one of those moments. Chuck D's words, his poetry, was like medicine for a weary soul. He was a man who spoke truth to power, a rebel without a pause. I have to credit Chuck for inspiring me to use my voice and my writing with deeper purpose. He showed me how I could best use the gifts at my disposal, and I've been striving to do that ever since. A decade or so later, life led me to Japan. I caught myself taking a much-needed break from that post-9/11 police state New York had become. I had no intention of staying here, but as I'm sure some of you can attest to, once Japan gets its hooks in you, it's kind of difficult to wiggle out. And this country did a number on me in those first few years, as you can see. Some of it was rather pleasant. My anger was substantially subsided, and my smile returned from wherever it had been hiding since Bin Laden opened a can of whoop ass on my hometown. But it wasn't all Hanabi and onsen. A great deal of what Japan hit me with hammered home the fact that I was as much an alien here as I was back in America. And I was fine with that to an extent. I mean, after all, this was no more my country than America was. So the onus was on me to try to adapt to their ideals, not vice versa. If I decided that their lifestyle didn't suit me, then I would go elsewhere, I told myself. I came to understand these ideals, and in many cases, they were in alignment with my own. The more vested I became, the more kids I graduated and sent out into the world, the more taxes I paid, the more love I gave and received, the more license I felt to not only propound the positives, but to air grievances as well. That's about the time I started documenting the good and the bad in the most engaging manner I could muster on my blog, Local in Yokohama. I wrote some very introspective and personal stuff because that's the only way I know how to write. And much to my surprise, considering the number of Japanese bloggers out there, it really took off, the blog. Yoko and Yokohama became one of the most recognized English language destinations in the country. A few years later, I wrote and published 2 memoirs. Hi, my name is Loco and I'm a racist, and Loco in Yokohama. I wouldn't exactly call them acts of activism on par with Chuck D's Fear of a Black Planet or Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. But like those gentlemen have done with their work, I poured my truth into these books. And aside from a great deal of accolades and, of course, criticisms, these efforts opened a lot of doors and garnered me access to other platforms, like the Japan Times. So, Black Eye, my column for the Japan Times, to my mind, this still wasn't activism per se. My goal with Black Eye is primarily to raise the awareness level of what people of African descent are doing here in Japan. Raise it among our Japanese hosts, of course, as well as among my fellow aliens here of every color and nationality. This was a void that definitely needed filling. In all my years here, just about every disagreeable issue I've encountered can be attributed to either fear or ignorance, or some combination of the two. In very few cases, in my experience, has the behavior here reached anything I can attribute to hate, at least not directed at me. I've seen it directed at Koreans and Chinese, however, so I have no doubt that hateful behavior is on the menu here, as well as, skip that. But I'm a firm believer that fear and ignorance left to its own devices will eventually lend itself to hate. And so it's best to address them while they're still addressable. Black Eye hopefully addresses some of it. And speaking of some ignorance that needed addressing, now, these guys are by no means new. They're a doo-wop group. They've been around since the 80s. They try to sing and obviously make and dress themselves like black performers from an earlier era in American history in order to, they say, show respect and pay homage to black people in music. I've been seeing them around since I arrived here back in 2004, but I felt then that if this was the kind of foolishness that Japanese people were into, who was I to say anything? But as the years went by and my investment in and understanding of Japan and Japanese people grew, the less I found this kind of buffoonery laughable. I mentioned it on my blog once, but just as an observation. I knew that they were aging and way out of vogue, and I hoped that they'd fade from the spotlight and take their homage with them. But then something unexpected happened. So what happened was they doubled down. They were not content to die out, but intended to pass this baton of ignorance on to the next generation, to some young ladies who don't even make black music. They teamed up with a J-pop idol group, Momoito Clover Zeto, and were scheduled to perform on Fuji TV's Saturday evening music fair program together in blackface. Even sent out this pic in advance to promote the appearance. So, after a decade in this country, as my official first act of activism in Japan, by my reckoning, here's what I did. You know what? Let me backtrack a step. Shortly before this incident, I'd recently seen 2 encouraging and successful acts of activism take place in Japan. The first involved one of the most famous companies in the country, A&A. This was back in early 2014. A&A ran an advert where 2 Japanese guys are talking about changing the image of Japanese people. Then one of them suddenly becomes blonde and has a long pointy nose. This is nothing new, of course. Japanese commercials have been racialized, have used racialized imagery probably as long as there's been Japanese TV. And as usual, some non-Japanese were very offended by it. And of course, some were very angry at the people very offended by it. And some said Japanese consider such traits complimentary, so if anything, it's good racism. And of course, some said it's just American racial oversensitivity rearing its ugly PC head again. Like I said, the usual arguments. Personally, I must confess, I was a little amused by it. Coming from a country where 150% of the time I'm looking at this kind of crap from the business end of it, it's rare to see fairly powerless white people looking down the barrel of racial offense. Then there was this guy, Julian Blanc. If you're not familiar with Mr. Blanc, he's a so-called professional pickup artist who travels around the world holding seminars, teaching men how to do the same. He's actually advocated sexually assaulting women in the streets of Japan on video because, well, it's one of those white privileges tolerated here. This time, I wasn't amused. I find misogyny repulsive, which is why I avoid clubs and gaijin bars, because in my years here, I have seen misogyny run amok. We have more than enough Julian Blancs here, mostly white guys, but some black guys too, doing what he's advocated and then some. Plenty of Trumps here too. The outcry once again broke the internet. It got international news coverage, and what I found most interesting, occasioned a petition in English and Japanese signed by over 50,000 people imploring Tokyo immigration to deny Blanc entrance into the country. Blanc's event was canceled out of fears for his safety, but chances are he would have been denied entrance. Several other countries have done so. So that brings us to this modern-day minstrel show. I mean, this nationally televised performance by a renowned doo-wop group and an up-and-coming idol group, both paying homage and showing their profound respect and admiration for black people in music by painting themselves black. By the time I got in wind of these pics floating around, Twitter was already abuzz about it, and the usual arguments were once again being held in English and Japanese. Pretty soon I was at my keyboard, and inspired by the A&A and Blanc incidents, I intended to ramp things up by writing a petition. And with a substantial blog following, friends in influential places, and a popular column in a national paper, I knew I could reach people. But what would I say? I was struck at this point with the realization that for the first time in my life, I was about to embark on an act of activism at the spear's head instead of at my usual position beneath a hoisted placard or in some other such support role. It gave me pause, mainly because for years I've been trying to diversify my portfolio. I didn't want to stuff myself into a box marked open when there's a race issue. And chances were this undertaking might not only get national attention, but international attention as well, if those previous cases were any indication of what's to come. So yeah, I took a long ass pause, during which I could feel the eyes of my grade school teachers, these guys, looking at me. I was sure the petition would be supported by some foreigners and attacked by others as well. That's par for the course when you're writing on sensitive matters involving race in Japan. But to me, this couldn't be a black thing, nor even a gaijin thing, though much of the rhetoric on social media to that point had tried to paint it that way. This had to be a Japanese thing. And I decided that that's the way I would tackle it. If I could get Japanese on board, if I couldn't get Japanese on board, then to me it would be a major fail. And I'll write it off as yet another lesson learned. So whatever I said had to be said to them primarily. What should I say? I had to present an argument that good people could see themselves on either side of. Of course, blackface in any country is problematic, but calling the people who find blackface performances entertaining racist was certain to shut down opportunities for dialogue, and that, I decided, was crucial. There would be no R-bombs dropped in this petition. The nightmare scenario I kept in my mind as I wrote the petition was one of Ratson Star and Momo Kulo playing homage to black athletes at the 2020 Olympics at the 2020 Olympics opening ceremony in blackface. Followed soon after by athletes throwing their sneakers at them and Beyonce and Kendrick Lamar grabbing the first available mic and exclaiming to the world, "Oh my God, Japan, you motherfuckers have lost your entire minds." While the Japanese hosts stand there in bewildered shock. That would be a most horrific way for Japan to finally learn some fundamental truths about being a part of the international community. So I wrote this petition. I had to make sure it covered two issues I believe, if acknowledged, might spare Japan a whole lot of undeserved grief. One, that as isolated as Japan might think it is, tucked away in its archipelago in Asia, and in this language and culture most think no one but Japanese can truly understand, digitally, nothing could be further from the truth. The world is watching with interest and in damn near real time. And two, if this program were to air based on this fairly insulated incident which unfortunately follows a series of fairly isolated incidents, that the same watching world will judge and label Japan and Japanese, fairly or unfairly, as racist or xenophobic, which, truth be told, though lacking the stigmatic kick of the R word, is equally as horrible and intolerable. Well, the petition was signed by nearly 5,000 people, the majority of which were Japanese, and Fuji TV decided it was against their best interest to air the segment. Though in their, thank you. I feel like I just did it now. It was against their best interest to air the segment, though in their statement they didn't mention the petition. Nor did they mention the open letters to Michelle Obama, who was en route to Japan at the time, nor to U.S. Ambassador Caroline Kennedy imploring her to weigh in. There wasn't much hoopla about it at all. Guess it wasn't as sexy as that Blanc business or pissed off as many white people as that A&A business, I surmise. And most unfortunate, the story of a Japanese media giant editing its programming wasn't mentioned in a single Japanese paper or TV news program. But the most important goal was achieved: huge Japanese participation in an act of activism. Just seeing those names and numbers on that change.org site was so gratifying, so faith-affirming, you know? I fell in love with Japan all over again. I want the best for Japan, and if I can help her in any way, I'm at her disposal. This activism experience did wonders for me personally. The tremendous response by our Japanese brothers and sisters managed to do something I had little faith could be done. It has diminished my feelings of alienation and isolation to almost nil. It continues to inform me, more than any other experience I've had since coming here, that though I know I'll always be an alien in Japan, this alien may have finally found the closest thing to a place he can call home. Thank you, Japan, and thanks to you guys for coming out.